Good morning. Barry Steinhardt from Friends of Privacy USA. Thanks so much to Lily for her thank you for the work that Miriam Marzuki and I did on these first 2 days, and I want to thank Lily and Jules for being so wonderful to work with, and in particular putting on such a wonderful conference. This morning's panel is going to discuss negotiations that are now going on between the European Union and the United States over the exchange of personal data in the context of national security, law enforcement, terrorism. I would take just a couple minutes to put that in some context. Before I do that, let me just say that we have an excellent panel here, including people who are directly involved in those negotiations. All of their bios are on the CFP site, so I won't take a lot of time introducing them, but I will introduce them briefly before each of them speaks. So let me just take a moment to put this into some context. These negotiations are important because, as you probably know, there have been a series of specific agreements between the United States and Europe over specific kinds of data. The most famous or infamous of those involve passenger name records, airline passenger records, SWIFT data, SWIFT being financial data, in some respects the Western Union of International Finance, and others. And the negotiations that are going on now are designed to try to reach an umbrella agreement about how that data will be transferred. They're important for a couple of respects, not only because the data involves sensitive information regarding law enforcement or national security, but because, and I don't think this is well appreciated by many, so much of the data is, of course, not simply law enforcement or national security data, the way we think of that, but it's in fact commercial data, as we've seen from other instances. And or at least for Americans, speaking from a purely provincial point of view, there's an awful lot of our data which is in Europe for one reason or another. And similarly for Europeans, there's an awful lot of data here in the United States. Secondly, in many respects, these negotiations, particularly if they're successful, will set a global standard for the transfer of information, personal information, across the world. And I know that people in Asia, Latin America, for example, are looking to these negotiations as a potential bellwether. Finally, I'll just say one other thing and to put this in some context. While a lot of the information that is involved here is commercial, because it is collected by government agencies for one reason or another, these are not the negotiations about purely private exchanges of data. There are a second set of parallel discussions going on. So. We're going to begin actually with a presentation to Viviane Reding. Ms. Reding is the Vice President of the European Union. She wasn't able to be here with us today, but we have a video presentation from her. Frank Schmiedel, who is sitting at the end from the European Union delegation here in Washington, will be participating in the question and answer period at the end. But Ms. Reding who was heading up the European side of the negotiations, was nice enough to provide us with this video. Actually, we'll start with another perspective from Europe. Jan-Philipp Albrecht, who's sitting here to my right, is a member of the European Parliament, and he is the rapporteur for the Parliament on these negotiations. So, Jan, why don't we begin with you? And Jan, we'll ask you to speak for about 12 minutes, and I'll let you know at say the 10-minute mark when this complaint is left. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, and Hello from my side. Thank you for that invitation to this very important panel. This is around the 6th or 7th time I visit Washington since the last 2 years. I'm in European Parliament now, working on those issues, especially privacy issues in the law enforcement sector, but privacy issues in general are very interesting in these times, but we will hear that there are other panels also dealing with the private sector. I learned very much during the last 2 years when coming here, having debates also with Marianne Callahan on the question of privacy and security and the different environments of policy making and the different perspectives being around there. And although there are different perspectives and environments on both sides of the Atlantic, I think that principles and values are quite similar. We share in the EU and the US principles and values like that the state always has to be less intrusive when it comes, for example, to fundamental rights intrusions. That we share the value also of fundamental rights, especially also the right to privacy and the principles of rule of law. And I think that this applies, I mean, to the whole range, the private and public sector. And I think that there is this question was, or the panel was named a clash of civilizations. A little bit. I have in mind this Huntington debate. I don't think that this applies really to this situation. I think that there is no real clash of civilizations between the US and the EU when it comes to values and fundamental principles. But of course, there are different perspectives existing in the United States and in the European Union, and I have the impression that in the European Union it seems to be a little bit more vivid, the remembrance to situations where those values eroded and those values perhaps were not so present as we wanted to have them. And sometimes people question me, especially when I come here. I mean, isn't it a little bit strange that you always point out the problem of the public sphere and data processing in the public sphere when all the people are using Facebook, putting their data into the internet and so on? And I am pretty sure that there is a huge difference between the private and the public sector, because it's about a relationship between people and state, a relationship which is based on fundamental rights and checks and balances, and that there are reasons also for this. I think, I mean, I can choose to be not part of Facebook. I can choose to be not part of online e-commerce, for example, but I cannot choose to be not part of a state, or I mean, unless I want to live in West Sahara or whatever. But I think there's no problem, no possibility to get out of this, and I give legitimacy to my government and to my institutions to. And give also power, executive power to them to enforce principles and legislation which I co-decide in a democracy. But to say it crystal clear, I don't think that there is a problem of fundamental conflict between both sides of the Atlantic, but I see that there's a problem of perspectives in policy making in general on both sides, and because on both sides we are in favor of effective law enforcement also. We are in favor of security. But the question arises, and not only transatlantic, but also on the local level, what is an effective law enforcement? What, for example, when it comes to crime rates, what is effective to lower crime rates? When it comes to terrorism, what is effective and necessary to get less attacks or less dangerous situations? And I think that crime science in the past have shown very clearly that, for example, more surveillance measures never really led to lower crime rates, and that's a very interesting point of view. I think that this became a little bit out of the debate, especially here in the US sphere, in between of the last 10 years, where we all were affected by 9/11, and also in Europe we had attacks, and in Europe we also had that problem that this priorities perhaps sometimes weren't right. And I say this also because on the other side, democratic engagement and freedom of behavior, for example, and freedom of speech is effective by more surveillance measures. And even more if it's invisible, or if it's perhaps theoretical. I mean, even if I just feel the weight, we can see that people are changing their behavior, and therefore it should be for both sides of the Atlantic, which we share democratic principles and so on, a very important point to instead of to invest in social security, for example, in education and development, which is doing both, lowering crime rates on the one side, and on the other side, strengthening democratic society, which enables also individuals to create a secure living together. And this, instead of huge surveillance measures, which sometimes are really threats to the open society. And I think that this is a debate which has taken place in Europe very much in the last 5 to 10 years. People got engaged in saying, we don't want to be part of a policy of fear. We want to have a society which is free, where people can have their own self-determination and can create a secure society without being surveyed the whole time.
Introducing them, but I will introduce them briefly before each of them speaks. So let me just take a moment to put this into some context. These negotiations are important because, as you probably know, there have been a series of specific agreements between the United States and Europe over on such a wonderful conference. This morning's panel is going to discuss negotiations that are now going on between the European Union and the United States over the exchange of personal data in the context of national security, law enforcement, terrorism, for specific kinds of data. The most famous or infamous of those involve passenger name records, airline passenger records, SWIFT data, SWIFT being financial data, in some respects the Western Union of International Finance, and others. And the negotiations that are going on now are designed to try to reach an umbrella. Good morning. Barry Steinhardt from Friends of Privacy USA. Thanks so much to Lily for her thank you for the work that Miriam Marzuki and I did on these first 2 days, and I want to thank Lily and Jules for being so wonderful to work with, and in particular, I would take just a couple minutes to put that in some context. Before I do that, let me just say that we have an excellent panel here, including people who are directly involved in those negotiations. All of their bios are on the CFP site, so I won't take a lot of time.